Tim Walz has something of a disagreement with Kamala Harris on rhetoric. So recently, in the wake of the stock market going down, in the wake of the tariff announcements and Doge, Kamala Harris said, quote, "There were many things that we knew would happen. I'm not here to say I told you so. I swore I wasn't going to say that." So she's pointing out that, she warned Americans, you can elect me or you can elect my opponent. My opponent is going to do bad things, plain and simple. And Tim Walz has a response to this. On CNN, he noted that Kamala Harris was the face of the Democratic Party's massive loss, saying she should own up to the result. Quote, "When I criticize, I'm criticizing myself," Walz said. "I own this. I'm part of the ticket, and somebody has to come up with a strategy." Tapper said that Harris's warnings were not compelling enough to win, a sentiment that Walz agreed with. Yeah, you do have to have compelling warnings, and Kamala Harris did have compelling warnings on a number of issues. Think about democracy. Trump, plain and simple, is a threat to democracy. Although, to some Americans, that might seem like not the most compelling reason, in the sense that you cannot eat democracy. You cannot use democracy to purchase health insurance or groceries. Democracy is essentially the backdrop of everything in our country, our government, but it's not necessarily directly helping people have their economic needs met. So what I see as the difference between Tim Walz and Kamala Harris is not so much that Tim Walz is much more of a nice guy, a play it safe guy, a guy who's afraid to be aggressive. In fact, on the campaign trail, he was less afraid to be aggressive than Kamala Harris. He called Republicans weird. He called them fascists. Although Kamala Harris, of course, called Trump himself a fascist, I do not recall her saying Republicans in general and J.D. Vance are fascists. Tim Walz explicitly said, look, these people are insane, they're fascists, but at the same time, they're just weird. So he was attacking them for their goofy behavior and their horrific policies. At the same time, he had that debate with J.D. Vance where they were able to get along, but Walz also took him to task on January 6th and on protections for pre-existing conditions. So if you're someone who's thinking, oh, that's it, Tim Walz, he's way too nice of a guy to go around saying this and go to be the president of the Democratic Party in 2029, he can't run. We need someone mean. As Vosh said, we need a psychopath. We need someone who is willing to go scorched earth, like just smear their opponent relentlessly. And I think Tim Walz would be capable of doing that. It wouldn't be so much about smearing the voters, attacking the voters. It would be about attacking the candidate. To Kamala Harris's point, though, she did warn people. Did she speak enough about material conditions and how the election of Trump might harm people's material conditions? Did she use the word stock market much during her campaign? Because that's the big thing that's going on these days. That's what all the buzz is about, the stock market tanking. Not necessarily, no. So there's a bit of a specificity problem. I told you so when something happens that you didn't necessarily specifically tell people about. But she did tell us that President Trump would be a bad president. And he's looking like a pretty bad president, worse than his first few months in his first term. So Kamala Harris, look, to be fair to her, she's earned much more of an I told you so than Hillary Clinton did. Hillary Clinton ran an awful campaign. She snubbed the left. Kamala Harris was a bit more welcoming to progressives. I mean, she straight up picked Tim Walz as her VP, whereas Hillary Clinton picked Tim Kaine, a moderate senator from Virginia who did okay in his debate with Vice President Pence and was fairly aggressive. But Tim Walz, you've got someone who's, got this model state of Minnesota in terms of progressive economic policy and someone who's willing to be aggressive. And Harris had a short amount of time to get her campaign in order. She had a short amount of time to get her messaging in shape because all the way up till mid-July, she was just going to be Biden's teammate, not really his attack dog necessarily. She's not someone who necessarily goes out on the offense super aggressively. And then she kind of got Tim Walz for that. But then Tim Walz sort of disappeared shortly after the debate with J.D. Vance. It wasn't that much of a thing. And as some progressives have criticized the campaign for, it seemed like Tim Walz was stuck in someone's basement somewhere, not able to really mount some rhetoric and not able to campaign. We don't know everything that went on behind the scenes. But yeah, I feel for Kamala Harris in that if I had been running against Trump, I'm not 35, by the way, and I had lost, and I had run a stellar campaign, a campaign where I warned people, look, we had one term of this guy. It went awful. It was terrible. It ended with an economic recession in 2020. It ended with people storming the Capitol. The economy was not particularly excellent, at least not compared to how it was in the presidency before, which was 8 years of a Democratic president. And if I lost, I would say, gosh, maybe if I had a little bit of alcohol, I would say, I told you so. I told you so. But at the same time, we do not want to come off as lecturing to voters. And did voters necessarily vote for every single thing that Trump does? We have to be honest with ourselves. Not necessarily. They were duped by the veneer of, hey, I'm going to lower prices. I'm going to lower prices. Prices have been very high under the Biden-Harris administration. Worst president in history. He has raised prices. Remember how low gas prices were when I was president? If you elect me, we will get back to the good old days of 2019. Please ignore 2020, by the way, and 2021, what happened right before I left office. But it was really brilliant and beautiful, and prices are going to be low. If people just focus on that, just focus on, oh, well, he says prices are going to be low. It's a conclusory statement, but it's compelling. I'd like to spend $7 instead of $8 and $6 instead of $7. People get won over by that. But do people necessarily pay attention to warnings about tariffs? Did Kamala Harris warn the public enough about tariffs? I don't know about that. I paid attention to the campaign trail, and I didn't quite see her hammering candidate Trump for his support for tariffs. To be fair, though, there were probably bigger fish to fry. There were. He was out there saying he was going to be a dictator on day one. He was out there calling political opponents vermin. He was talking about how he has concepts of a plan for healthcare. And I mean, that's just, first of all, not only is it a stupid thing to have come out of your mouth and something which on the campaign trail you deserve to get relentlessly beat up for in a metaphorical sense, it's also illustrative of his poor understanding of policy and illustrative of the fact that if you give him a Republican Congress, there's no telling what's going to happen to healthcare. It will almost certainly get worse. The Affordable Care Act wasn't this amazing thing, but holy cow, Trump wants to tear it down, and he just has concepts of a plan. He said it twice in the debate and in an interview with Kristen Welker. So yeah, I think Kamala Harris warned people about stuff that was important. I don't know that she really warned about everything that was most important. People might be tired of the democracy is in peril rhetoric, not so much because they hate democracy, but because they want someone who's going to focus on meeting their needs. Democracy is the best system outside, I can't think of anything better. So she's not entirely wrong to think that that's the way to go, but too many people probably take democracy for granted. And very few people take for granted the idea of getting their needs met, except for perhaps the most wealthy in the country. We know that any moment an emergency could happen, something like that, something which could blow a hole in our wallets. It usually doesn't, but at the same time, people are hemorrhaging more and more cash from their wallet as a result of higher grocery prices. Inflation was lower at the time of the election, but prices in general were still high. And it became kind of the single issue of the election. And Kamala Harris, she gave good warnings about the dangers of Donald Trump. Donald Trump himself gave great warnings. His first term, we learned a lot about him. We learned a lot about him during the Biden presidency. And in fact, we might have even learned more about him during Biden's presidency than we learned about him during his first term. That's a hot take. But he was going around the country throwing these temper tantrums about how he actually won the election, how there was massive voter fraud, being constantly unable to explain why prices are high. He didn't even talk about any single piece of legislation where he's like, the fact that Biden signed the American Rescue Plan is what caused this inflation. He never said that. So he's a buffoon rhetorically in that, he can't really make his case. He's a buffoon on policy, I should say. In terms of campaigning, I mean, he knows how to get out there and hold rallies and attract large numbers of people. So I can't necessarily call him a buffoon in that regard, because that's something that is enviable to a lot of politicians. But for crying out loud, Kamala Harris was out there, perhaps sometimes in too many words, explaining the problem with Donald Trump, explaining the merits of her campaign. And Donald Trump was out there saying, basically, Joe Biden did bad because prices are high, and I can't explain why prices are high, but they're really high. And by the way, Kamala Harris is a communist. And I won't define what a communist is, but you should be really scared by the fact that I, the ultimate truth teller, am saying that she is a communist. You should absolutely be terrified that you're going to get sent to a gulag, even though Trump's sending people to El Salvador in prisons right now. But yeah, you're going to get sent to a gulag if Kamala Harris wins. That was his message. She's a communist. He even said fascist at times, I think. And conclusory labels, apparently, they're not compelling, obviously, but talking about low prices at a time when there's high prices and there's a different party in power, I guess is kind of compelling. So I sort of agree with Tim Walz, but at the same time, I sort of feel for Kamala Harris. We should take our issues up with the Republican Party primarily. We've got to push them away from this, insane sort of mold that they've formed recently. It's putrid, it's disgusting, and we've got to get voters who know better, or at least educate voters on the dangers of the Republican Party. I shouldn't say know better, but in some ways, some of them should know better. Like they know the problems with the Republican Party. They know the Republican Party hasn't cared for them. But, maybe this time they will. Trump's campaigning on it, right? No, he's not going to do it in 2024. He didn't do it in 2016. And he's not going to do it in 2024. That's the deal. Sometimes history does just repeat itself. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, or subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Morris the Merrier, and I look forward to speaking to you in my next video.